We passed through Salerno without stopping and continued on to Naples proper. Therefore, we did not participate in the defence of Salerno when the Allies landed there on the 9th of September. We were stationed north of Naples near the Volturno River. Our front line in Italy stalled for the first time. We built up our positions and waited. In late September, the Americans moved away from the Salerno area and approached Naples. When the city fell on October 1st, we were fighting a hard battle to hold the line. The Volturno defence line gave the Germans some breathing room, and we held it for a few days. From the Volturno we moved north to form the Gustav line in the Uri River Valley, along the Gigano and Rapido rivers, and the town of Cassino and its neighbour, the monastery of Monte Cassino. Cassino was approximately 50 kilometres north of Naples. After Naples, it appeared that my unit was setting up lines of defence at approximately 100-kilometre intervals. The Gustav line would prove to be one of Germany's most formidable lines of defence during the war, and we resisted the Allies in a bloody and treacherous battle at Cassino for months, from mid-January to mid-May 1944. It was the biggest and bloodiest battle of the Italian campaign. We spent a cold and horrifying winter in Cassino with no relief. As bad as it was, let me tell you, it was nothing like Russia after Moscow. I could stand almost any hardship, and I had to. Still, the Americans made sure that we were no longer associated with the Panzer unit, and we hadn't been for some time and wouldn't be again in the war because of the static and totally defensive nature of the Italian campaign. We were part of the German 10th Army, the main German force in Italy. Our commander, General Heinrich von Wietinghoff, was an able leader and would do his best to design our lines of defence for the next 12 months. For several weeks after mid-November, there were few troop MOVEMENTS as we prepared for the enemy attack. When the Allies landed behind our lines at Anzio on January 22nd, we were still on the Gustav line. The Battle of Cassino was deadly and a terrible sight. The constant erosion reminded me of Smolensk and Bryansk. In one respect, perhaps it was worse, simply because it lasted so much longer. There were times when our guns were used almost hourly, either repelling attacks or supporting our counterattacks, as long as we had ammunition. In the early spring of 1944, when it became apparent that the Monte Cassino area would fall, we moved southwestward from Cassino, and we could not turn back because the ridges were directly north. We were directed to move up the coast near Foria and Gua on the west coast, still behind the Gustav line, and then we were better able to advance up the coast to the north. Our unit bypassed Rome and helped form the next line of defence north of Rome. After Cassino, the front lines we always established, one after the other, were consumed, and we moved to the next as we advanced north. Then we heard the news that Rome was taken on the 4th of June, a great propaganda and political victory for the Allies. Hannibal was only the first great warrior to long for Rome, the last were Churchill and Eisenhower. During 1944, we were not without certain definite advantages. The country was designed for defensive warfare, with continuous rocky hills, narrow passages, and narrow winding roads, and we used the terrain everywhere. When we ended up with a position, a road or a bridge, when we left it, we could disable it to make it difficult for anyone trying to follow us. Winter cold, rain and mud now welcomed the Allies, as they welcomed me in Russia in 1941. The weather worked both for and against both sides, and in Italy it easily became the hated enemy of both sides. We continued to establish semblances of defensive lines, one of them crossing the Italian peninsula between Pisa, Florence and Arto towards the Adriatic. When this line was broken, we gathered our things and moved again, this time to form the so-called Gothic line. It was a heavier fortified line consisting mainly of mountains, the Apennines, from near Carrara through the peaks to Pesaro, near San Marino. The line was held until mid-September. Once over the Gothic line in September, the Allies advanced rapidly out of the hills into the Po River Valley north of Bologna. Thereafter, it appeared that the race was between their armoured and motorised forces and our forces on foot. But by October, rain, snow and mud stopped them again, and the advance stalled around the Gothic line until spring. In April 1945, Wietinghoff travelled to Switzerland with SS General Karl Wolff to negotiate the surrender of our troops in Italy with the American intelligence officer, Allen Dulles. Wietinghoff and Wolff were very much afraid of being executed if that became public, since they did not yet know what was happening in Germany, and they devised a wonderful method of capitulation. It worked as follows. Suddenly the highest command post was on the move and could not be contacted. The next corps command post was on the move and could not be contacted. The divisional command post was on the move and could not be contacted. This meant that they disbanded the whole German army by eliminating the command posts, and the soldiers were saying, "What do we do now? We can't contact anyone for instructions." So they decided to go home. Wolff, after the war, was the first commander of the police in Munich. I don't know if it was his reward for taking such action or what was left of my unit. We never really knew that we had capitulated. We only knew that everyone was on their own and on the move. We were never aware of an organized surrender, and this fact is not mentioned in historical accounts or talked about. It is a part of history about which very little is known. I can only tell you my theory and my interpretation. In my opinion, Viertinghoff and Wolff were afraid to talk about it to protect their lives, because they knew what the SS and Gestapo were doing in Germany, including retaliation against the families. At the same time, I think the German General Staff also collapsed when they found out. At that time, it was simply a complete command error, no communications at all. Basically, it was a dissolution of all the battalion commanders, because the regimental commanders were gone and the rest were saying, "Okay, let's go home." This is my perception as I remember it, and I know no one ever talked about it. From experience, I was in an artillery command post, and all the higher command posts simply disappeared at that time. Most of the German soldiers were looking for an opportunity to surrender honourably. Slowly, yes, slowly, we felt that the war seemed to be going very badly for Germany. The only thing that prolonged the war was the Morgenthau Plan, and when the Morgenthau Plan became known, a lot of people said, "We're dead anyway, let's keep fighting." Remember that the US Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, proposed to turn Germany into an agricultural country. I got the impression that the Morgenthau Plan was the best propaganda tool for the Nazis and, in my opinion, prolonged the war for several months. There also continued to be great concern about the Allies' insistence on Germany's unconditional surrender, which substantially reduced the willingness of German leaders, except in Italy, where Generals Viertinghoff and Wolff sought alternative forms of surrender with certain conditions to protect troops, property and rights. In Germany, however, there were many people willing to accept a fair peace settlement. The war in Italy was, for the most part, what might be considered a civilized war. Everyone knew that you didn't shoot on Christmas Eve when you had British troops. You also knew when it was tea time on the other side, and you didn't interrupt tea time with silly shooting. We were more than willing to respect tea time and Christmas, so as not to irritate the other side. The respect of the Allies was mutual. We generally had enough supplies, except that artillery ammunition became a real problem in the winter of 1944 and 1945. Italian farmers helped us with food as we retreated. In reality, the Italians and Sicilians acted without exception like human beings. They did not Mussolini mattered. We had practically no contact with the Italian army, and, of course, they disappeared after the capitulation of Italy in 1943. The winter of 1945 was relatively cold for Italy, and apart from the harsh winters, the weather in Italy was excellent in general. The roads were acceptable, and compared to Russia, they were superb. We slept mostly in farmhouses, primitive but comfortable. The combat situation in general was bearable, if that is the right word. When a soldier has no other choice, it is not as extreme as it had been in Russia. My unit had already crossed the Po River in northern Italy in mid to late April when I was captured, somewhere near Tiglio. The spring offensive against the Gothic line along the Apennines had begun in the first days of April. At that time there was no organized defense, only scattered German units, fragments, and each one was trying to save its own ass. Sorry if I put it so crudely, but that's the only way. My battery had disbanded, some were lost and others were heading in different directions in the confusion. I had pretty good maps, and I was hoping to get back to Austria at that time. At that time, we had soldiers in the German army who were 14, 15 and 16-year-old boys. I called them babies and Boy Scouts. They were hardly adults. But the Germans had to use them, and they drafted them and sent them to the front with a rifle and a helmet. I only saw one or two actually fighting, but I heard that some of them fought back. They were scared too, scared enough to flee to the border away from the Allies on their way home. A group of 15 or so needed help and adopted me as their leader. At the time, I was with a couple of other privates from my unit and agreed to let them join us. This was my second opportunity to lead during my military service, and I wasn't much better that time than before with the artillery unit. They must have seen in me someone who could lead them back to their mother's arms. When they saw an old guy like me, I was the oldest. They must have seen a father figure. I had my gun and some ammunition, but they had no guns, just some knives. But these guys had not received proper training as soldiers, and as we walked and ran fast, they soon began to complain. First they were too tired and couldn't walk, then they were too hungry. The whole situation was too difficult for them, and they needed a rest. I couldn't abandon these kids. I had grown fond of them, but I wanted to keep going. If I had told them that I didn't give a damn what happened to them, I could have made it to Austria alone, but not with all these Boy Scouts running after me. What should we do now? We need a rest, we can't walk. To make matters worse, I heard that there were Italian partisans in the area and that we should stay away from them. I did that for a while until it was almost too late, and my first encounter was not pleasant. I also heard that the Americans were capturing German units, scattered in the areas I was crossing. It was every man for himself, no communications, just some rumours of German soldiers moving as fast as I was moving home. We almost reached South Troll and the foot of the Alps, I think north of Alia, which is about 60 or 70 miles north of Bologna. I had some addresses of places to hide in Austria, and figured I would have to walk at least several days to get to the border, but what good would it have done me to return to my home country? The Americans were also fighting my country, and they would surely cross the border. Taking care of the boys personally cost me enough time THATWEWERA, all eventually captured by Italian communist partisans who blocked our advance northward. This was about the end of April. The date escapes me, but I remember very well my only contact with the Italian partisans. We were standing on the road with our hands behind our necks, as we were told to do. I was afraid, and I knew they would kill us. The partisans could not agree among themselves as to who would have the honour of shooting us, and argued for some time about what to do with their new prisoners. At that point, the distinctive characteristic of the Italian personality we had come to know, their inability to make decisions, worked in our favour. Soon an American tank arrived, and marching at the front of this tank was an American sergeant, the first black man I ever saw in my life, maybe 6'3", a very big guy. He had a machine gun, and he quickly understood what was going on. He turned around, picked up the leader of the partisan group with one hand, and then dropped him with one punch. His men took us into custody, and we became the property of the Americans. The sergeant then told the partisans to move away, and they did so without hesitation. By this time, more vehicles and troops had arrived, so there was no further discussion. Since then, I have had tremendous respect and affection for black people. This man had saved the lives of almost 20 German soldiers in our group. Without him, I would not be alive. God bless him. He was a humanitarian. He didn't care about our colour, our uniform, or that we were the enemy. He knew what his objectives were, and he accomplished them. It was 0 hour for us, and it was also the most moving event I saw in my entire service. I will never forget when we got on the trucks to go to the prison camp and saw the American storage areas far away from the lines, trucks and supplies. We could not believe our eyes, such material superiority. We scratched our heads and wondered why it had taken them so long to catch us, although it took a year and a half. In essence, it was not really a sustained war. For the most part, it was a succession of more or less minor battles, except, of course, Cassino and Anzio. And after a certain time, the Germans decided to withdraw. It was like the General Sherman to Atlanta in the American Civil War. I was sent to a prison camp at Puglia, outside Naples, through a camp on the way. I can't remember the date the boys were separated from me at that time. There were about 30 million German soldiers in captivity in Puglia. We had problems with tents and problems with food, but I must say that the Americans did their best. We were surprised to receive anything when we entered the camp at Puglia. We had large tents and conditions became tolerable. It beat sleeping in cottages and barns, and with the good weather, some of my memories of Russian peasant houses in the snow were erased. The first half year in the prison camp was just subsistence. The Americans finally provided us with the food and clothing necessary to keep us alive and well. After the first 6 months, the Americans gradually became more organized, and although we were prisoners, we were accommodated in surroundings that could not have been better. We heard over a loudspeaker in the camp that Germany had surrendered, and later that the Japanese had also surrendered, which meant that the war was over for everyone. The camp was a large automobile manufacturing plant. We POWs were divided into teams of mechanics and worked there. I learned a lot about automobile repair there. Months later, in 1946, when I was in the next camp, further north of Rome, I was in CHARGEOF, a car repair shop for the Americans. Conditions by then were more relaxed, and familiarity between the Germans and our guards was accepted. I knew of no one who tried to escape, and one by one we were being released to return home. The only depressing situation that arose was the concern of anyone who had family in the Russian occupation zone, as I did. Vienna, where my family lived to my knowledge, was divided into 4 parts, as was Berlin. My address was in the American zone of Vienna, but Vienna was in the Russian occupation zone of Austria, the same situation as in East Germany. We, who had relatives in the Russian zone, had no news, received no letters for a year, and knew nothing about the fate of our families during that time. I wrote to my family in Vienna from time to tell them of my situation, but I never received a letter in reply. If it had occurred to me to give as my address that of my mother's sister in the American occupation zone, a place and person I could identify as my address, I would have returned home a year and a half earlier, because the Americans first released prisoners with addresses in the American zone, or with addresses in the British zone or the French zone. The last to be released lived in or behind the Russian zone. I was in the prison camp in Italy for 2 years, and did not get home until the beginning of May 1947. It did me no good to protest occasionally, as there was nothing the camp administrator could change, but he gave me and others like me some degree of understanding and perhaps sympathy, and some privileges as long as we behaved well. I know some German soldiers who didn't behave well. We had an interesting system in the camp, and in the beginning, for a long time, we had our own guards living in the American prison camp, that today would be considered a break from the real world, so to speak. We had good food, the weather was nice, and we didn't have anything that you would consider bad treatment. We were practically self-administered. We even used toilet paper and napkins for the first time in a long time, not for writing letters, but for what they were intended for, much improved toilet facilities and sanitary conditions. Sickness among the soldiers decreased. In addition, we had automobile repair, a real luxury for someone who had been mostly on the front lines since September 1939. We didn't get a salary, but what would we have spent it on? All we had to do was sit and wait for release, a long wait for me, as I wondered many times what I would find at home and what the future would hold once I was released. Under pleasant conditions, the monotony and uncertainty of living from one day to the next was a little more bearable. I was in Podoli for more than a year. I became good friends with a fellow who was much older than I, a lawyer, a sergeant, and after the war secretary to H.A. Fagel, the advisor or chancellor of the Bundes of Austria. Fagel finalized the agreement between Russia and the United States to end the occupation. My friend left a little before me because he had an American address. Through him I got to know the Bundes councillor quite well. I think Fagel was the only one who could drink the Russians under the table. He was an agricultural engineer. His father had a big wine business. He spoke Russian, English and French fluently, an extremely intelligent guy. Everywhere. There were several thousand American trucks, and German guards and American guards were working side by side to supply the Italian market with spare parts and tires, which was against regulations, of course. Looking back, under the conditions in Europe at the time, this kind of deal was not at all unusual. We took advantage of everything they gave us. But slowly and surely, the Americans wanted more and more of the profits, and the spare parts ran out. And then the deal ended. I know this because we had to transport the trucks to Loro to be shipped back to the United States. I had a big truck with cranes and a forklift, and when we picked up the cars, only the cars in the first row had batteries and tires, and the cars and trucks in the second row had no batteries and rarely had tires. Trading cars was a small way in which the Italian economy was restarted. That's how we saw it at the time. Cigarettes became the preferred form of payment for the fastest car repair service. If a guy wanted his car repaired faster than everyone else's, he paid with extra cigarettes. I started smoking in 1933 and didn't quit until 1999. Cigarettes were one of the most important and popular items in the camp. I remember when we arrived at the first prison camp, and we were given a pack of Camel American cigarettes. We lay down and smoked one after the other. We couldn't believe such luxury. I always got enough cigarettes, mostly American. We used every resource and kept the butts in metal boxes, and we always had enough to roll more cigarettes. We rolled our own and used newspapers, toilet paper, anything, and we always had enough toilet paper. At one place we got Italian tobacco grown in Italy, which came in bags of 20. We called it the last revenge of the Italians against us Germans. At first we couldn't smoke it because it was too strong. Then we washed it with lemons to take the taste out, like making a tea. We dried it, and then it was so wet that it didn't burn. We needed at least 3 matches to light each cigarette. It was the most horrible tobacco I ever saw in my life. That's why we called it the ultimate revenge of the Italians. But for those of us who needed the sustenance of tobacco, maybe it was worth the struggle. I considered my time in the prison camp as 2 years of studying practical applied psychology. I learned one thing. Those who survived best were really simple, intelligent farmers, honest people with a solid but unsophisticated religious background. Willing to accept life as it is, they accepted it with grace. Those people survived mostly unscathed. Those who had the biggest problems were what I call the middle intelligentsia, people who had studied a few semesters in college, but not enough to understand what they had studied. They were the ones who knew enough to complain, to philosophize, but didn't know enough to accept their ignorance on most subjects. They almost collapsed mentally at first and found it very difficult to adapt to prison life. They knew a lot but understood nothing. They complained about how bad the world was and had no belief system. I found the assessment of the people very interesting. Let me tell another story. It was Christmas of 1945. We had a tent for the Catholic priest and another tent for the Lutheran pastor. On Christmas Eve, there were suddenly hundreds of people in front of the tents. The Catholic priest said, "Those who have come today just to find comfort I don't need. Will they be here tomorrow?" This was my first clash with the Catholic Church, but it would not be my last. A few years later, I converted to Protestantism and have been that way ever since. There were many times when I feared for my life, but I never feared that I would not survive the war. I pressed on and never gave up hope of returning home alive because of the prayers and letters of my family, my own convictions, my education, and my firm constitution, and I knew I had to keep my mouth shut too. Yes, I saw comrades killed, but many of my comrades survived the war. Those who survived the first battle had a greater chance of surviving the second battle than someone who was new to the second battle. Those who survived the first half year or the first year had a much better chance of survival than the newcomers. Then, if you survived the second bout, your chances of survival got better and better. You became more cunning, your instincts were sharper. What you would call a gut reaction was more relevant. I proved that this theory would work. I guess I survived campaigns and many battles in Poland, France, the Soviet Union, Sicily and Italy, and in the prison camp I saw and experienced more than my fair share. For example, you had a certain instinct, almost a sixth sense for danger. We had a sense of when to duck and when not to duck. We were often under enemy fire, and we were very quick to move, seek cover and protect ourselves. It's amazing how fast you can move if someone shoots at you. For protection, most of the time we would try to dig a temporary hole, maybe a foot or a foot and a half deep, so we could just lie down. It can be done quickly. Having a shelter is more psychological than real. It's almost like the ostrich sticking its head in the sand. Obviously, we preferred to stay in houses, barns, or anything with a roof. In 1958, my wife, children, and I got visas to come to the United States and took up permanent residency. We had an old Dodge, a wonderful car, and every weekend we would go out of New York to the country to see as much as we could. It took me a few years, at first I wasn't even aware of it, to get over the urge to check the road ahead for the next place to hide in case someone started shooting. The need to seek shelter was ingrained in me, and it took me years after the war to conquer it. To learn this behavior, one must live through some experiences. As the chance of survival increased with the length of service in the German army, we had a general unofficial doctrine that we were to fear our superiors more than our enemy. In addition to our superiors, we had the iron arm of the SS, the enforcers, which we were to fear at all times, as well as the so-called spy or informer, who was probably in our unit. In all armies, I think there's a different mentality or morale, depending on whether you're marching forward or marching backward, deep into enemy territory. In Russia, we really weren't interested in defending the country if we were attacked. We weren't surrendering our country, we were surrendering a part of the other guy's country. The closer the war was to German territory, the more vicious our defense became. The further we got away from home territory, the weaker the defense became. Does this always apply to the nature of war, or just to the soldiers? I knew that once the war took a turn, it could be argued that the German defences at Cassino were not protecting our territory or that of the enemy. It was like neutral ground, and preventing the enemy from getting any closer to our land was important. We had very few Nazi fanatics among our men. Maybe 1 out of 100 were the true believers, maybe 10 out of 100. But the remaining men at first were only interested in completing their 2 years of service and then returning to home in one way or another. The 2-year limit stopped as soon as the war started. Then it was for the duration, or until they were dead or seriously wounded, to the point where their usefulness on the front lines was nil. Regardless of the few fanatics, a war is an experiment in survival, and not an experiment in heroism. This experience in survival is independent of colour, social status or education, and goes back to the most fundamental biological desire to survive. I love my children, parents, spouse, whomever, but I want to live. It comes down to Maslow's hierarchy of needs at the lowest level, plus love, for a very limited group of people. If we can accept this, we devalue all hero stories and, to a large extent, all ideologies. The crucial points are that one cannot live without an ideology, but neither can one live with one. This may be similar to being married. For this I can't find intelligent answers. This statement may be somewhat trivial, but some situations and events are incredibly difficult to describe for someone who was not there. And I am almost amazed at the lack of understanding that American veterans have expressed to me. I've been told that, other than historians and immediate families, the average person is not interested. I have reflected on this many times as I considered writing my memoirs and wondered what benefit it would bring. I have also wondered if anyone has negative feelings toward me because I fought for Germany over 50 years ago. Yes, I was one of Hitler's soldiers. This I cannot deny or change, but surely the warm and close cooperative relations between West Germany and the United States as allies since 1945 will influence how someone views me and the insignificant role I played. In this I trust to be the case, and this sentiment helped me to embark on this memoir. The war I fought in was the most destructive and horrible war of all time. I pray that it will never be repeated in any way, in terms of duration, intensity, carnage and damage. I decided to present my recollections in the hope that someone can learn, someone can empathize, and someone can be in a position to avoid anything similar in the future. There is enough of a historian in me to realize that history can repeat itself, and that, in general, human beings do not assimilate its lessons. I'm not just talking about the Germans, who started and lost 2 world wars in this century. There are many other examples I can use that will be understood. Remember the Vietnam War, the Lieutenant C incident, and the My Lai massacre. Put yourself in that position as a German soldier in World War II. A motorcycle courier doesn't come back, and we find him on the street with his throat cut. Next time we send a truck with 10 or 12 soldiers, and nothing happens. Then we lose another motorcycle messenger, go into the village, and all we find are some old women and small children. I'm talking about a partisan war or guerrilla was irrational. We faced this in many places, especially in France, Russia and Italy. Eventually you get to the point where you shoot everything that moves and ask questions afterwards. I remember the recognized strength of a night attack in Russia. I don't know how many shots we fired out of fear or in reaction, but the next day we discovered we had hit some animals. Still, it was a preemptive war. Kill it before it kills me or one of my comrades. Finally, a soldier does not act as a civilian considered rational would. I don't ask, please identify yourself, who are you? I could care less who you are, I want to stay alive, and I shoot. I don't have to know what I'm shooting at. I believe that when Lieutenant C was convicted, no one in the court had been in a partisan zone or experienced guerrilla warfare. I accept that maybe C went crazy, but he was not a criminal. There is no such thing as a rational war period. With rationally behaving people, it is an impossible dream, regardless of how much operational research is done on rational warfare. In the end, what remains is that no one wants to die. National and military objectives are fine, but ultimately everyone wants to survive. I have always had a sense of humour. If I did not have a sense of humour, I would not have been able to survive the war, captivity, or the years right after the war. If my group was together long enough, I got to know the different individuals slowly but surely. I knew with whom I could talk halfway decently or express feelings, and with whom I had to be cautious. There were those few fanatics. They may not be bad people as human beings, but fanatics about the cause put them in a class of their own, and with them I had to be especially careful. I don't have precise data, but I would estimate that the number of deaths in my artillery units due to combat actions was relatively low, definitely no more than 15%. Most of it was from counter-battery fire, a few casualties from tanks, a few from the air, very few from infantry. Probably only about 20% were wounded, which is not bad for a German unit engaged in so much action. The heaviest losses were in the Russian prison camps. The Russian prison camps, let's call it murder, understand why that was so at first. The Germans supposedly started killing prisoners and civilians because, first of all, our leaders thought they were almost subhuman and much less than Aryan like the Germans. If you are a Russian soldier and you barely have enough food for yourself, you may not be willing to give much food to prisoners. However, if you are an American soldier and you have food to spare, you may be happy to give low-quality food to get rid of it. War is an atrocity in itself. World War II was an atrocity in itself. War is always about property, whether it is to acquire someone else's property or defend your own. Everything. The rest is a smokescreen, but you need that smokescreen because if you tell the truth, many people would not be willing to fight. I have learned not to judge. Let those who are free of guilt cast the first stone. I never saw in Russia or elsewhere human atrocities towards soldiers or civilians. I did not capture any enemy, nor did I see any being captured. I did see hundreds of prisoners of the Polish, French and Soviet armies being sent to the rear, and from my observation, they were always properly treated according to the rules of war. On the other hand, I met a comrade captured in Stalingrad, a doctor who died a few years after his release from a prison camp. He was out of his mind, a vegetable due to his experiences in captivity. At the beginning of this account, when I started researching my old material, I almost suffered a panic attack. I was unwilling to go any further. When I finally managed to overcome this feeling, I was able to look back and felt relief. The panic attack or shock was similar to what we call in the United States the Vietnam syndrome. I believe that every soldier who goes through a war loses a part of himself. Something in him is destroyed or not complete. I don't know what I should call it. The big difference, and it's significant, is that when we, the German soldiers, came home from the prison camp in 1947, and those who had come back before, we just didn't have time to be aware of my syndrome. We didn't have time to sit in self-pity and lament ourselves or our generation. We had to do whatever it took to stay alive. Our lands were partially or totally destroyed. We would go to the farms to trade family pieces like a gold ring or a watch for potatoes or a few eggs. We wanted to live, and we tried to stay alive. In conditions like this, you don't look back. You just look forward and think about how to survive the next day, how to survive and move on. You move on. You tacitly accept that 0 hour is over, and it can only get better, regardless of what the future brings. I think every soldier is capable of having similar experiences. When we are on the front line, we do not philosophize. We do not discuss the value of the world, the value of humanity. Sometimes we prayed, sometimes a lot, but we did not engage in essentially useless conversations about anything, nor did we march in protest. If my stomach is full, I have warm clothes for the winter, and in the summer an air conditioner. Then I can have many ideas about how to improve the world, what to occupy myself with. Only then, let's face it, Maslow's hierarchy starts with survival, and at the top is satisfaction or self-actualization, as it's called. I am not dreaming. I always tell my students that if I am an advanced artillery spotter and an enemy tank approaches, I run or hide or shoot, but I definitely do not conduct a survey. Today we have images showing the civilian population as they began their journey back to Germany from Russia. All of those images were accurate, but there is a psychological development of the breakthrough that is always ignored in history. The French historian Fernand Braudel, who wrote about the history of the daily life of the population from 1600 to 1700, was the first author who tried to talk about daily life. We read in history about things you can see, big battles, ethnic cleansing and all those things. Do we really understand how people feel, what it means to be afraid, what it means for a mother to cry for her child? This is what gives meaning to life. We are always in the clouds, and really ignore life in all our stories. We talk about the beautiful victories. We should talk more about the beautiful lives. For the first time in modern history, at least in the German language, an Austrian baroness spoke about her war experience. She wrote about the war between Prussia and Austria from the human side, my mother's side. In battles and victories, you can identify the general who won and the general who lost. Then you find 100 reasons why somebody won or lost. Who today mentions the 20 million people who were shot under Stalin? Who today mentions the 20 million people who lost their lives in the gulags under Stalin? Who today talks about the thousands of children killed in the Holy Wars and the Crusades? No one does. Their lives have been reduced to a number, a statistic. I realize now that when we venture into this area, we can lose any belief in human progress. I regret this very much at times. I have the feeling that we are on the same level as cannibals, only we find that human flesh is not good enough to eat. I could not help but feel and understand the significance of these concepts. I had no desire to be part of a grand design of conquest. All I wanted was to do my job for my country and end the war like the rest of my comrades. I was not a Nazi, nor did I want to be one. In fact, my political leanings were in the opposite direction, as I described at the beginning of this account. I was a young man of 19, fresh out of the gymnasium. I did not ask to enter military life, and I certainly did not ask to go to war. I had no choice. Conscription is the same in all countries, but under the Nazis it was a little harder to avoid. He had thoughts and hopes for the future, as an engineer perhaps. As an artillery soldier, Frisch had a job that for the most part was very impersonal. I didn't have to see the results of my work, the shell that landed 20 kilometers away, and count the number of dead, whether soldiers or civilians. As we went along, I couldn't tell if it was my battery or my gun that had destroyed the cottage we were passing, or killed the family pet. Artillery work, for the most part, is very impersonal. There were also times when the war was impersonal, as it is called insensitivity. In July 1934, the family was spending our summer vacation in Carinthia, at a lake where my mother's brother had a summer house. Here we received the news of the assassination of the Austrian Christian fascist Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss by the Nazis. The local militia formed units to defend Austria against an expected German invasion, while Mussolini protected Austria. But the smell of war was in the air. It was a dreadful week. I also remember well the 12th of March, 1938, when my mother cried. It was the first time since my father's death in 1929 that my mother cried. Hitler made his triumphal parade through the streets of Vienna. Unification had happened. I still hear his words now, we, our fatherland. My mother had strong ties to the old Austria, and unification with Germany was unimaginable to her. Our freedoms were gone. Today, I'm more concerned about the potential danger we Americans face in losing our freedoms. Look at General Colin Powell, for example, several years ago. He was invited to speak at Harvard University, and people protested his position on gays and lesbians in the military, heckling him with no respect for him or his position. If we continue like this, in the end, no one will be allowed to speak in public because everyone offends someone. One may be too religious and another too liberal, among others. This is called political correctness, and it will limit free speech, free thought and free expression, leaving it up to the state to decide in court or by administrative judgment whether First Amendment rights no longer apply. This means we could get to the point of saying, yes, Mr. Hitler, and this is what makes me shudder. I have lived this. The good thing is that in the United States we do not have a unified force or a universal political philosophy, as we had under Hitler and the Nazis. Maybe this lack of uniformity will prevent a catastrophe. I hope so. This is something the Americans simply cannot understand. What it means to live under an absolute dictatorship, such as we had under Hitler, and even worse under Stalin. You are not free to speak or act, and every word you utter can be used against you by someone. If in the United States you say that the president is a fool, your friend might look at you and agree with you, or he might say, "Come on, don't say that." In an absolute dictatorship, everyone lives for themselves. No one engages in political discussions. Parents are afraid to speak freely in front of their children, and teachers might get the message. All attention, actions and interests are oriented towards survival. Rationality is eliminated. The world becomes self-centered and revolves around the family. I'll tell you a story. I had a very good friend, a 1% honest guy who didn't come back from Stalingrad with me. We stayed together in a little hotel room after the campaign in France, and one day we were talking and he said to me, "France, if you say this one more time, I'll have to denounce you." We were good friends, but he believed 115% in the Nazi cause. This is what Americans cannot understand. If Americans understood this, they would realize that freedom is not a right, but a privilege. It is a privilege we must preserve, and we must earn it every day. There has never been a book written about how the screw was slowly tightened until all freedom was lost. Government, centralized or not, it can grow until it has the power to take what you have. This is what I fear. A book like this has no glorious stories to tell. There were no glorious stories. I saw it happen like this. The little teacher who educated children about freedom and worked in a school close to home was simply transferred to a school 2 hours away. The teacher was not interested in travelling 2 hours by train in the morning and in the afternoon, so he stopped talking about freedom. This was not supposed to happen to him. It was just a warning, a message that everyone understood. Suddenly parents were afraid to talk in front of their children. Kids could say silly things to their friends, and then their parents could have denounced them. This is why I am so against what I hope is not misconstrued as politically correct speech. I am beginning to distrust this term. It reminds me very much of the time when we had to know what politically correct or politically incorrect speech represented and how it would affect our lives. When I returned to Vienna from prison in May 1947, I realized that the whole world had completely changed. Suddenly one Sunday, there was an announcement in the newspaper that the German mark was being exchanged for the new Austrian shilling. We could carry our ID, as everyone had to have a photo. We went to the bank and withdrew 100 new shillings from our savings account, regardless of what we had deposited in the account. I had about 1 old mark in my savings account, a considerable amount. I only received 100 shillings and a stamp in my savings book and on my ID card. The money was suddenly changed, and everyone started a new era with 100 shillings. My mother was a teacher and received a uniform salary of 100 shillings for a few months as a government employee, but then salaries began to differentiate. The shilling had been the Austrian currency before unification. Overnight, the black market disappeared because she had lost all her money and had no way to exchange it. The currency became worthless. At that point, the economy started to recover. In the Russian zone, we were very reluctant to do anything for fear of being expropriated or occupied by a new Russian unit. Nobody painted their houses. The West, including West Germany, began to recover economically. Life was flourishing there. When we ex-soldiers went to university after prison, we were classified as Heimkehrer, which means late returnees. We had certain privileges in choosing courses free of charge. They were roughly of the type of privileges that soldiers had in the United States, such as the GI Bill. It didn't cost us anything, and our freedoms came back. My old artillery units held some reunions in Vienna, but I lost contact with them after I went to live in the United States in 1958. I doubt if there were more than 200 men out of hundreds who survived. Most of the losses occurred in the part of the unit that was sent to Stalingrad, and many of the others ended up sinking on the way to the Afrika Korps. I had a friend in Vienna with whom I attended the gymnasium, and the last time I spoke to him was in 1991. He is Jewish, but he converted to Episcopalianism. My family hid him in our house during the war until he was able to escape to Switzerland and regain his freedom. He is now a retired vice president of Kaiser Aluminum. He got sick, and I really needed to call him. It is never too late. So much for today's video. Remember to subscribe and leave your like, so we keep bringing content for all of you. Until next time.